Well, I think a good way to start is you could just tell us your name and when you were born. Where?
Mary Frances Morrill, Morrill, and I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the Cambridge Hospital on June 10th, 1928.
But of course now your last name is Anderson.
Oh, of course, ever since 1956.
So where did your name come from?
The Mary came from my grandfather's sister, who was a missionary in China, and the Frances came from the director of camp, the founder, I think, of the camp that my mother and father were at the time that I was born. Coincidentally, her name was Frances Booker. She and her husband had a boys' camp and a girls' camp on, I think it was Iona Lake in Conway, New Hampshire. My father had been a counselor there. Then when he married my mother, he brought her there too. And Charlotte, there's a picture of her swinging on a swing, and I think that she was also a very happy camper there.
So tell me about growing up in Boston.
Oh, fun. But where our house was located was only about 15 minutes from Harvard Square. And so we could actually walk to the bus stop and take the bus to Harvard Square and catch the subway. I wasn't riding the subway until I was in the 4th grade, but I had braces on my teeth. And I was allowed to ride the subway, which was a thrill. And my brother was also riding the subway to go to his choir rehearsals at Emmanuel Church. The subway took about, well, it was advertised to take 6 minutes from Harvard Square to Park Street. And you could always get in the very front end of the subway, and the front end was beside the operator's little booth. And you were in a window, and you could see the tracks in front of you. And when we went around some of the curves, you really wondered if that individual subway train was going to stay on the tracks. Great fun. I loved it. And then all the shops and all the glitter, and it was a lovely time to go to Boston, and it was dreadful to go to the orthodontist.
So can you tell me about your parents?
Very strict. Victorian, terse, not explaining their actions very much. Pretty dictatorial, anticipating that we would pull our weight and do our share, set the table, do the dishes, clear the table, wipe. We didn't have to scrub floors or do laundry or anything of that nature as I was growing up. I had a lot of fun with, I had a special great time when I had the whooping cough, and I was isolated onto the porch of our English-style gabled house. And I was in the porch area, but the French door had enough space underneath it so I could play checkers with my brother. And so I had whooping cough on one side, and he didn't catch the whooping cough on the other side. That was a great achievement.
You'd slide the board back and forth?
Right.
Under the gate?
Under the door. Anyway, it was a pretty house, and we got it by luck. It was at the time of the Depression, and the man who was the first owner had to go to China for his work, and he sold it, I guess, at a very ridiculous price. And it was new. It was only about maybe 3 or 5 years old. And it was very close to the Heights, which was in Arlington Heights. It was a nice area with new school and lots of land and new people. It was fun. Boston, I don't know too much about Boston except that I was awed by the experience of going to the Emmanuel Church when my brother was a choir member and then later an acolyte, and the church itself on Newbury Street is one of the most grand interiors that you can imagine. And it was right next to the Ritz-Carlton and across from F.A.O. Schwartz. So we had quite a toot when we would go in to hear him in his choir and listen to Dr. Osgood preach and be on board in the Emmanuel Church. For those who are interested in my mother, and it was pretty fascinating what she did. She got tired of picking up any eggs from the chicken coop. And she said, "This is not a life I want." And she had taken music lessons throughout her childhood. An aside is that there was a teacher who didn't like her and kept her back every single year. And fortunately, she was in a one-room schoolhouse, and she kept up with all of the ages. So when a new teacher came in and she was in the 7th grade, suddenly she was a 7th grader. But before that, anyone who actually read the record would think, "Oh, poor Marion, she's not being brought along with the rest of the students." In any case, she loved music and drawing and was good at it. And she went to her father and she said, "Could I leave the farm and go to a Detroit normal school and learn how to teach music and drawing?" And he agreed, and she went. And this she did as soon as she graduated from high school. And she learned to teach it and graduated from it, and then looked around for a job and found a job in Conway, New Hampshire. Her father said, well, when she said, "What is Conway like?" "I'll bring down the atlas and I'll show you." And it turned out that he said it had a few more mountains than anything around Romeo, Michigan, but it had much of the same weather, and he thought that she would get along very well. Well, this creature, at about the age of, I would say, 19, went to Conway, New Hampshire, had to teach music between 5 schools, commuting by train, and presumably did very well. We've seen some of her reports, Anne and I have, from a scrapbook she kept, and she was right up there with the top salaried people. Anyway, along with this adventure of her teaching in these 5 different schools and commuting by train, she met my father. And how their relationship went on from there, I'll leave for the next chapter. He was the oldest of 3 brothers. His sister was older than he was. And he was a woodsman, primarily. And he grew up in Plymouth, New Hampshire, and he was an impressive enough student. So when he simply was a lumberjack, a teacher who had come to visit at the mine that his father was supervisor of a mine in Plymouth, a teacher that came to visit said, "Raymond, you really should go on to college." His father was opposed to paying for any of his 3 sons going to college, even though he was a college graduate from the University of Maine. And so Dad took it seriously. I'll take the time to tell a cute aside that Dad told me. When the teacher needed to go home, and they had the house at the top of the mine, Dad said, well, he decided that the teacher should really go home in the mine chute, by way of the mine chute. And that was a day of hobble skirts. And unfortunately, the teacher was in the ahead of Dad going down the mine chute. And when she got to the very bottom of the mine chute, you can imagine where the snow was. In any case, that was just something I thought was rather funny. Dad did go on to the University of New Hampshire. He worked on a farm for the first 2 years, joined the Theta Chi fraternity for the last 2 years, and had an absolutely wonderful time and learned to be a teacher. And because he was so good in basketball, baseball, and football, he was a teacher coach. In any case, he left the University of New Hampshire and instead went over to be a teacher in an elementary school in Conway, New Hampshire, where he met Mother. Dad was born in 1896, and so therefore our First World War was going on at the time when he might easily have been in it as a soldier, and he couldn't get in it because he had scratched an eye with a barbed wire fence. And so he would not be left out. And towards the end of the war, he went, at the same time that he felt that he needed to be a soldier, he joined the Canadian Army. And he was there prepared, all prepared, and his regiment actually went out the day that he came down with the flu. And so he actually missed the opportunity to go to the European War, to the First World War, and I think he always regretted that he wasn't part of the action at the time. Unfortunately, his mother was in a munitions factory through the war and caught the flu, the same flu that Dad had, and was succumbed from it. She died from it. And I don't know exactly at that time. Probably his father was down in Coney Island, New York, where he had a smelting affair going. I don't know exactly how, whether he owned it or what, but in any case, he went to Coney Island, New York, where he could have the greatest source for an electric furnace for melting the ore that he brought back from Plymouth, New Hampshire. There are many parts of my life that I'm extremely enthusiastic about. One of them is camp. My parents were camp counselors. My father was in charge of swimming and horseback riding. My mother was very clever with crafts. And from the first time that, the first summer after they were married, they went to camp, which was not far from where they met and where they were living. Conway, New Hampshire. The camp was in Eaton. And the camp's name was Pine Knoll. And Charlotte was already a camper there as they were going through the years. Steve was probably also, because I have pictures of him when he was taking care of me, when we were walking and he was 4 and I was 2. In any case, I was taken to that marvelous camp called Pine Knoll when I was 28 days old. Nothing to it. There were plenty of people, and the black cooks were absolutely enamored with a 28-day-old child, and they took care of me through the summer while Mother and Dad went on and did what they ordinarily did. They were my father and my mother. I'm here, and my brother is here, and Charlotte is here. We're camp counselors in the summertime. Anyway, this ensued until we finished, I think, after 3 years there, and then went to the farm for a summer, where Granddad Stephen, S-T-E-P-H-E-N, by the way, needed Dad to help him. It was at the time of the Depression, and they then went on and stayed through the winter season. And Dad was not, I think, Dad was not employed that year because he and Mother felt that their biggest duty was on the farm. I was 3, and Charlotte would have been 8.5 years older, so she was about 11.5. Steve was 2 years older, and so he would have been 5. And Anne wasn't even on the horizon. Okay, and then that brought us back to Pine Knoll Camp the following summer, and from then on, let me see, we were there at camp, and no, that was the summer we changed camps to another camp called, the following camp, to a camp called Kauaian. And I actually stayed at Camp Kauaian and was involved until I was married, and graduated from being a cub there when they had little bear, middle bear, and big bears. And I was a cub, but finally became a little bear, finally became a big bear, finally became a junior counselor, and in the end actually had the feeling that I was head counselor. And that was the year before I married. And the following year the camp closed, and that was 1957. Okay, well, this is at Pine Knoll Camp, and my father has already been a counselor there, perhaps for 2 years, before he brought my mother on board. And he is here, and he was a counselor for both swimming and for horseback riding, and probably for the trips outside of camp. Then these are counselors that were helping him, and then all of a sudden, here is Mother. And she also is appearing in this picture, and it was her first summer. I didn't know what to wear to the costume party. And so suddenly I decided that I would just get a barrel. And so I put on a meadow skunk, and I wore the skunk for the costume party. The camp itself didn't have a specialty, but at the same time, they had a very rounded program, so that if one wanted to be on the water in boats, or up in the inside, what I'll call the forest of the camp, with horseback riding and tennis, that was available also. It was a very well-rounded camp, but one of the beauties of the camp was that though we had scheduled activities in the morning, after rest hour in the afternoon, the individual campers were allowed to do whatever they wanted. It was run by a director of a private school in Sewickley, Pennsylvania, called Sewickley Academy, and it was founded by a woman who was a real philanthropist in New York City, Elizabeth D. Ambler. And she decided, when they were working so hard in New York City, to have a vacation for the associates, and they founded this camp up in New Hampshire at that time, Alton Bay on Lake Winnipesaukee, and the camp actually started in 1910. The idea was to take care of children. The idea of these women was to take care of their children, of the children of mothers who could work.
Right, so I understand.
From camp, let's talk a little bit about the college years. I graduated from high school, as everybody else did, and then I went on to Ohio University. My major interest in anything that I'd had in high school, other than art and music, was chemistry. And so I thought I would major in chemistry. My father said I shouldn't, because I ruled myself by emotions rather than brains. But I went ahead and stubbornly developed a course in chemistry with a Bachelor of Arts degree and a major in English. And I had enough of organic, qualitative and quantitative chemistry so that I could qualify for a job in medical research at Mass General. Yes, one of the best things I did in my life was to have the opportunity and actually go to Norway. And it wasn't necessarily Norway that I was headed for when I first thought of the idea, but when I was working, I thought how nice it would be to be able to spend a little of the years while I was single in one of the Scandinavian countries, or possibly Denmark and Germany. And so it was very fortuitous when we were working on Saturdays that there was a Norwegian doctor that came into the laboratory, and I asked him if he knew of any possibility that I might have to work in a Norwegian laboratory for a year. Well, he wasn't really interested in my going to Norway as much as he was interested in having one of the chief technicians, an awfully good one, come over to have my experience at Mass General, at least to be in Mass General, and then she was going to be part of the competition that he was going to have when he wanted to take over the chief position in the Rikshospital, which is the city hospital in Norway, in Oslo. And so he mentioned it to her, and she thought it was a wonderful idea. So suddenly, between the two doctors, the one that hired me and this doctor, we had an opening that could be an exchange. And lo and behold, timing for that was the following November, and then it was arranged so that I would go to the research laboratory that she was working in. And many of the same procedures that I was doing in Boston, I was doing in Norway. It was a laboratory, it was a research lab that was to study renal tuberculosis and we were using dogs as the subjects, and it was the top floor of the Ullevål Sykehus, which was the biggest hospital out on the edge of Oslo, and I couldn't have been happier. I had her apartment. I met many of her friends. I picked up cross-country skiing. The friends that I had furnished some cross-country skis for me. They actually spliced a broken ski so that I had a pair of cross-country skis. I had my own, but they were too heavy. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Tell me how you go skiing in Norway.
Oh, it's a trick. There are some.
A complete sentence.
There are some. Yeah, it would be very interesting actually for America to adopt the way in which people can queue up and then end up in the same place and all fan out. So every weekend there was the opportunity for people to go and line up for the electric tram. And the electric tram went on a circuitous route to the top of the national forest. So the electric tram had also little pockets on the outside of it, and people would get on the tram and put their skis and their poles in these pockets, and up the mountain they went. And they would get off depending upon the route that they had already decided to take. And usually it went so that it was slightly lower where they were picked up or where they caught the tram than where they began. And then there were two restaurants on the top of Frognerseteren, and it was delightful. A ski group, at least 3 skiers, had gone over the trails by the Thursday before this all took place on Saturday and Sunday. And the trails were then marked out by skis rather than a snowmobile, and it was much easier to control the skis. And the maps and the routes were known by the people, and it sounds as though it was very crowded, but actually it was such a hugely large national forest that it was rare to run into other people or have to get off the trail in order for other people to pass or something of that nature. It was just one of the most wonderful experiences. And it wasn't really hard. It was a push, but at the same time it wasn't really racing. So we went, I guess the furthest I ever went was 30 kilometers in a day, which would be about 20 miles. It was good fun, really good fun. And the Norwegians were especially fun, and they would laugh a lot. And if you fell, they would especially laugh. You would sprawl and then pull yourself up out of deep snow. It was beautiful, just beautiful. I love Norway. They were very, very friendly and awfully good to me. My apartment was interesting. My refrigerator consisted of bricks that I took out of the wall. And the shopping was frequent enough so that I didn't really have anything that I had to keep cold for a long period of time. I gained a lot of weight. I absolutely adored the cheese and the bread. And it was a wonderful thing to do. I wish more people could have such a private exchange. It was so simple. It was interesting. I would go to work in the dark and come home in the dark. Oh, one thing that I should mention so that everyone knows. We had a simple breakfast consisting of sandwiches, perhaps, and then maybe a sandwich at lunch, which was around 11 o'clock. And then at 3 o'clock, 3:30 in the afternoon, the working day was over, and people would go to their various places and have something more to eat, and then plan to rest, and then have the main meal. I guess the main meal actually was around 4 o'clock, and then they would have another something to eat before they went to bed around 9 o'clock. And they played in the free hours, so they had as much playtime as they did work time almost almost that in the ordinary day. Mary Morrill was the sister of my dad's father, so therefore she is then therefore my great aunt, and she was a missionary. She was originally a teacher, and then she caught a religious fervor and decided to be a missionary, and she went to China in 1892. It might have been 1890, but I don't know right now. And she was one, Elizabeth Gould was the other of these women who went from New England to China to establish this mission, or help establish this mission in Poting Fu, to teach Christianity to the Chinese. I have her letters. I have the mandarins that the Chinese worshipped before they took up Christianity. She came back in 1898 and she brought some artifacts with her, and I, because I'm named for her as Mary Morrill, have inherited these things. She's been a course of question with me because I don't have the same religious fervor that she had. I would rather see our missionaries go over for medical help rather than Christian help. And so then therefore I have had her more as a person in the background of a symbol for my life than the person who would be the leader of my life. At the same time, I feel an allegiance to her because I'm named for her, and she was murdered there when the Boxers came in and took over the school that she and Elizabeth Gould had established. It's a never-ending question in my mind. There was a young man who refused to ever wear commission clothes, even though he became a general, who witnessed this massacre that happened to her, and then therefore had 3,000 of his troops ultimately converted to Christianity. But that is simply the word as it's come down through the Congregationalist movement, and I still hold to my belief that her claim and fame over there was to make some women who would never have walked, walk. She did it by going out into the countryside and encouraging the women to free the bound feet from the young women, and which they did. And I have a written description of what it was like for a mother to watch her child being helpless by having to have bound feet. Our last chapter is at Norway, and I came back. I was lucky to be able to work another year at Mass General, 7 months anyway, because I was paying my father back $100 a month because of that, my using his letter of credit for traveling in Europe. And then off I went to camp, naturally, and then from there I had this wonderful job in San Francisco, working at the University of California, San Francisco, again in the same type of research that I had been doing at Mass General. Well, then, and it was with more pay, and I thought that, okay, the research was very worthwhile, and all was going well. And then I met a man, and he was a young man that had just finished doing 3 years of extra training in Connecticut and Boston, and looking for space in the laboratory there. Well, I didn't think much about him, but I knew that we didn't have much space, and so nothing came from that. And then a little while later, he had bought a Dodge sedan, and he turned out that the circumstances were such that he wanted to go skiing, and I wanted to go skiing, and at least 4 other people wanted to go skiing, all female. And so we filled up his Dodge and went off to Dodge Ridge. And he was a doctor, he was a musician, he was an excellent pianist, but really not my type, and quote unquote. And so we still managed to ski together, and we brought aboard a Swiss who was a teacher of skiers who happened to be over for about 3 months to do research. And with Albie and Bernard and other ladies that wanted to go up to the various high points, mainly Dodge Ridge, we then spent time together. It turned out that as going to the end point, turned out that this man I got to know very well finally, and he thought I was great, but he was nothing I wanted, and that was the beginning of a courtship in a backward sort of way. He was a wonderful person, and I appreciated him, and I especially appreciated his appreciation for music. And it happened that that was one of the greatest things that we had in common as far as what he was like. He had one drawback, and that was a mother who wanted to live with us, and that was not, in my way of thinking, something that I could do. So even though he backed off after our first interest in each other, he still stayed around and was my alarm clock every day and my Saturday night supper in wonderful restaurants. The cute thing about him was that he was with a wonderful sense of humor, and time for him was just simply one of patience. And in the end, when he said finally for the 3rd time, "Will you marry me?" I said yes, but we have to do it within 2 months or 6 weeks or whatever, but it was a very, very short time. Or I knew that I would change my mind, which I knew I shouldn't do. This history may be a little backwards and forwards, but in any case, it's necessary, essential, that I tell what I admired about him so much. I loved his love for music, and he could play the piano with the most beautiful grace. Then I also loved his courage when he had a heart attack to decide that he was going to go ahead and see the degree of the damage. And then he changed his career into having regular hours by studying nuclear medicine. And by then being a candidate for nuclear medicine as a staff physician, he got accepted to a job in Boston. And I was right back in the home front, and I loved that. We kept the house rented in California, and that was just a detail, but it was a good thing that we did, because then ultimately I can be back where I had the children in their growing up stages. The thing about Byrne that impressed me so was his quiet understanding of all types of people. He was not critical. He would take them where they were, and he would appreciate them as they were. And then the other thing that was also such a great benefit for all of us was his very dry sense of humor and the ability that he had for punning. I really think that I didn't know it at the time, but I certainly made one of the wisest choices that I could have made by marrying him, and we had a delightful family life. We're just so lucky. And I really think that the most exciting thing that has ever happened to me in my lifetime, and I've had a wonderful life, the most exciting thing was having one child born on the day that it was due and having the doctor say, "Well, this is puny, maybe there is another." And my saying, "Please, God, of the opposite sex." I didn't have any idea what sex the first one was. I didn't even have any idea that I was going to have twins. But I knew that should I have twins, I really wanted them to be of the opposite sex. So one was born at 4 or 5, and I won't tell you which, and the other one was, or who, and the other one was born at 4-1. And they had to stay in the hospital until they gained more, and that gave me a week out of the hospital to go around and get the extra things I needed for our little house on Diamond Street. It was all fun and games from then on. It was easy to bring them home. They were so tiny, I cut up the diapers in half, only to have a friend tell me, well, that's not a good idea. Until 2 weeks later, I realized, no, it indeed wasn't a good idea. But in any case, we had this wonderful house on Diamond Street. We had the twin stroller, and we had mobility, and we had interested children, and it was, for me, I would say, one of the most entertaining and possibly happy circumstances in my life. For both of us, for Bernard too, but he could come home and play the piano, sometimes waking them up, much to my consternation, but at the same time, he also was thrilled with it. When we brought them home, he made the comment, I think I've been elected president. I'm not sure that was such a good idea, but at the same time, that's how high he felt. It was all fun and games from then on. I can't tell you, they were good campers. They could get into any type of situation we were enthusiastic about. They wanted to join in. They wanted to be a part of it. They wanted to always spend any time that we had at the beach or around the tide pools. They were good travelers in the car. They were happy people with other people around. They went off to the same elementary school, and then their classes were divided when they were in the second grade. But they both excelled. They were in El Morro Elementary School until they were through the 5th grade. Everything that I had to do with them was just a beautiful experience for me, and a learning one, because they were so enthusiastic about any type of new experience. And all you had to do was say, we're going camping, and they were there packing their bags. It was a change when they went off to Michigan for the year, but they said goodbye to their friends, and it wasn't that big a wrench, and then they were ready for all kinds of new activities, namely the snow coming in around them, cross-country skiing, which we tried with all of us having the same size on the same skis, and skating across the pond, going off to 7th grade in a totally newly integrated school system, leaving by dark on the bus because they didn't have daylight saving, coming home by dark, learning to live on a farm, learning to tie flies, learning what the 4-H club had to offer, and there was something, I believe, that had to do with the sports. It was totally changed environment, and then off we went to New England, fortunately the following year, and it was another totally changed environment. By the way, when we were in Michigan, there was a very unusual thing that was happening. When we went into the 7th grade, they had to face a totally new challenge, because for the first year of the 7th grade that they were going into, which was in Ann Arbor, they had integration. So the school kids, black and white, had a bit of a difficulty figuring out how to treat this. There were bomb scares that were coming into the school. The school had kids that were carrying over feelings that their parents were generating, and our kids, who had been in an all-white school and with blonde hair, and everything being so similar, really took this on in a remarkable way in which they could simply say, this is life and this is progress and we will go through this too. And they would come home with stories. In the end, even their yearbook was taken out of their arms at graduation. But at the same time, I think that, and I've never heard them ever say, but I think that it was a very interesting way in which they came in from a very protected environment to a much larger society. It was for sale for $20,000, and we had it at the time that they were born, and we had it until they were 2.5. And then the people who owned it turned around and rented it to us. So after we sold it, this is one of our favorite places in all of Laguna Beach. And Bern loved it as much as I did. And I had a stroller, and when Dana and David could come down here at all, then we would put them in a pen on the beach, a round pen that shrunk and expanded. And then when they were able to walk, then we would use the tide pools that are out on the point. And they loved the warm water and the salt water of the tide pools. It was so wild. They didn't have the fancy houses you see here. They did have Betty Davis's house, which you'll see in a little while. And then they had also abalone on the rocks. And we could go down and with a tire iron actually get them off the rocks and get enough of them for supper. There are no abs there now. We didn't have the fancy stairway that I'm standing on at that time. We actually had stairs that were cut into the rock to come down. David and Dana were very accommodating because they loved it too. So if I had to have one stay in one place while I was doing something with the other one, they always would mind. It was great sport. I want to point out Betty Davis's house. It isn't the reason why we bought near here at all, except it was a huge attraction. And it wasn't more than a month or so after we moved in 3 blocks up that they had an auction for her furniture. And I bought her patio furniture, which was redwood and had been roped together. Could have bought her bedroom set for $700, but I didn't have $700. We didn't know it when we moved into the little house that had been built in 1928, 376 Diamond, but we had a perfect gem who also lived next door. Her name was Catherine Miller, and she was a teacher, a retired teacher from the LA school system, and she had been teaching both cooking and sewing. We didn't have any contact with her until we came home from the hospital and said we had twins that we left in the hospital because they had to stay there an extra week. Well, that was just not even the beginning. The beginning happened about 6 weeks later, and she hadn't bothered us or tried to be in our world at all. And then all of a sudden, 6 weeks later, she came over with these little jackets and diaper covers for the little twins that were Anderson twins next door. And that was just the beginning. She went on through all of the years. She made marvelous clothes because she was really a specialist in sewing. And she would make matching twin outfits for the kids, and they absolutely adored her. And she never came to visit us without a cookie in hand, and they never went over to visit her over the fence when she wouldn't have perhaps a popsicle, or at least if she didn't have a popsicle, she would have something of equal delight. So she was our surrogate grandmother. Catherine made that dress. I could suddenly look for land. Well, I found a marvelous piece of land up in, I didn't know anything about Emerald Bay, but it was up in Emerald Bay with large trees and what ultimately became 7 acres. And when I talked with the person who was in charge, he said he was going to save all the trees even if he needed to build around them. And so we went, well, there was a man who was a AIA right at the bottom street of Diamond Street at Coast Highway, and I went to him and talked to him about drawing up plans for us. And his name was Don Williamson, marvelous person, and he was just the right person to build a house for us at that time for the four of us. We lived in the house. It was a bit avant-garde, but at the same time, it was everything that we could possibly want at the time. We lived in the house until we moved to Michigan, and then we moved to Lexington, and we kept the house rented through all those years because we didn't know whether we were going to want to move back to it or whether we were going to sell it. In 1993, there was a horrendous fire. We were insured completely, and everyone around us, I believe, were also insured. However, the entire street was right down to the ground in every way, trees included. And the idea was that we would save everything that I made, or at least enough so that we could buy a car. And also the squirrels. We had I don't know, it was some sort of fancy car that Bern had, and we left it in an apple orchard. And the squirrels had gotten into it and eaten the electrical wires. So it wasn't reliable. I don't remember. I think that we got rid of that car when we purchased the station wagon. But anyway, we had this Oldsmobile Vista station wagon, which was with what they called a Vista dome. So when the kids were lying in the back of the station wagon, they could see through these windows to the tops of the mountains. And that was one of the additional features of this marvelous car. So we packed up, and the other idiosyncrasy that happened was that David had a rowboat, and before he went to Michigan, he was surfing in it with other guys, surfing also. And I thought that was an experience that would be lots of fun. So one of the last days, we went down to surf his rowboat. Unfortunately, the waves were high, and it went over us and tea kettle on, and I probably had the arm go out of the socket because it was hanging when I had raised it to make certain that Dave wasn't caught underneath it. I went out in the waves and it got back into the socket, but I had ripped the cuff. Dan and I are looking at a breakwater in Oceanside Harbor where four men, all brothers, went out to sea. And I happened to be along on a boat that was captained by Gene Ober, who was the conductor for the opera, and a lot of other opera people, as well as Bernard, as well as the twins. And a fog came in. It was November 11th. And a fog came in so that we had trouble getting back into the harbor. We had been out fishing. And we heard a sound. And Gene Ober said, "What is that?" And I said, "Sounds like gulls." And he cut the motor, and it turned out to be help. And lo and behold, these four brothers had gone out in the afternoon, and their boat had split from bow to stern as they were going out over a wave by the breakwater. And they'd been in the water for 2 hours, and then they all said goodbye to each other because they couldn't stand it. One of them was holding up another. And we saw them as we turned our boat around, and then we were able to radio for the harbor patrol to guide us into the harbor. We had been lost. We had been going up and back trying to find the entrance to the harbor. So it was just one of those very, very lucky events. And I saw one let another one who had been holding go. And so I went over the boat and swam to him and towed him to the boat. I went over the edge of the boat, and then I towed another to the boat, and then I couldn't do any more because of the gasoline in the water. But it was considered a really important rescue. For me, who had taught life saving, it really wasn't all that big a deal. But we thought that it might be interesting for posterity, and so we came down to Oceanside Harbor to give you a glimpse of what those men have been through. It's a lot easier to enjoy this creature than it is to quarrel about the Bank of America. You know? I'm about to show you something that I consider a little bit of a miracle. Okay? And I happened to be in the hospital, and in the bed next to me there was a woman, an old woman from Iran. And her family came in and they brought a lot of Persian lemons. And they gave me one, and it was so sweet. And I took the seed and I put it between paper filters, the type for a coffee pot, and kept it moist. And after a period of time, it had a little tail, a little white tail. And I took the white tail and I put it in dirt or potting soil, or something like potting soil, and it grew. And I then, at some point, and this was 10 years ago, at some point I went ahead and put it in the garden. And it was this tree, and I thought, well, I need to have another in order to have any lemons. But lo and behold, this spring, there was a flower, and look at the lemon.
Da, da.